I have a special guest, as usual, an expert in the field of New Testament studies, and of course, I would say late Second Temple Judaism as well. Professor James D. Tabor, welcome back.
Great to be with you. And I would even expand that and say ancient Mediterranean religions. So
yeah,
the Greco-Roman world. I work with Jonathan Smith, so
exactly. Yeah,
not exactly a narrow focus guy. So, yeah,
for sure. Anyone who knows Dr. Smith knows that he is what young kids today would say the OG of biblical studies, and I'm privileged to have you here today. I hear we've got some discussion about the teacher of righteousness. We're going to get into 5 things we could pretty much rest our hat on or go to the bank on, probably pertaining to the historical Dead Sea Scroll teacher of righteousness that was part of the Qumran community. We're going to dive into that. But first, let's get our shameless plugs out of the way and mention you have a website where people could sign up and get part of your email list for free. You don't give out people's emails, but they get notified about a lot of stuff that's coming up. Looks like you got a tour on the Apostle Paul coming up. You're going to the Mediterranean?
It's a cruise. Yeah, I've never done this before.
Ooh.
So we're going to do, Italy and Greece and Turkey and all the islands. And I'm going to talk about the seafaring Paul. And it's got 6 lectures and I think there are 9 different stops. People can click on the link and read about it.
Yeah.
And it gives me time to hang out with people like you, because I'm going to try to get you to go. So,
I actually might jump
you
on.
and Ryan need to go. You've done the Holy Land. You need to do the Mediterranean cruise. Plus a cruise. Sure. Are you kidding?
Yeah, we have never been on a cruise, and I'm moving in August, so I'll be in Florida, and hopefully we'll be situated. If we are, let's do it. Let's go. I'd look forward to that and seeing some of the ancient sites that are at least said to where Paul has gone, and then look at the Greek and Roman world in a way that
Pompeii, for example, you've got to go to Pompeii, Derek. You're walking the streets of a Greco-Roman village. I'll take you in the brothel.
So I can read
everything. I've been to Pompeii a lot, and I've been to Corinth. I've been to Athens. So, and the other thing about a cruise or a tour, because I have that Israel tour that you've been on, is to hang out with people that are our friends, our followers, our fans, even maybe, and to have that leisure time. Remember on our tour how we could just sit and talk at night around the campfire.
Yeah.
And that's part of it, is just hanging out with people, on a one-to-one basis. So,
yeah, I look forward to that. I'll have to talk with Ryan, and you and me will talk offline and see what our schedule looks like. But I would really like to do something like that if we can make it happen. And I want to make it, so everybody else, you can go and sign up as well if you're interested in going on a cruise.
This is really just to advertise the blog, jamestabor.com. That just happened to be there. I wasn't even planning on mentioning the cruise, but there it is, because I just put that up yesterday.
Well, that's what I saw. I was like, hold on, seafaring, what? Because you're always doing something. You do not stop. You haven't skipped a beat. You'll be in the grave moving around. Okay, that's how much Dr. Tabor moves around. We did a course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This one right here, you compare Jesus to the Qumran community, at least seeing similarities and differences and diving deep into the scrolls, learning things. And today's topic is going to cover this, but not only can people sign up for the course, you're doing Zoom lectures with students. You've been doing them for a long time. You got another one coming up. When is that one?
The last Sunday of the month. I think it's the 28th. Let's see. Yeah.
Of this month?
Yeah, 28th of January. And what I do, you study this course at your own pace. You can see the lectures over there. It's got a huge course pack, all kinds of supplementary readings. It's self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
But if people sign up between now and the 28th, the link to that Zoom meeting will be there. You don't have to have finished the course.
Right.
And we're going to discuss in detail, really centering on the teacher. It's part of what we're going to do today. So I'm giving you just a teeny little glimpse today into some of the material that we'll cover. But today we're going to do his career.
Okay.
What do you know you know how we say, when I study historical Jesus stuff, I always say to the students, first day of class, what do we know about Jesus and how do we know it?
Right.
Now, not an easy question to answer, with many, many scholars weighing in and having different conclusions. But the key is to get your method down, I think, to all agree on what are some of the sources and the texts that could be used. So I just want to do that with this enigmatic figure, the teacher of righteousness. Michael Wise calls him the first Messiah, this wonderful book by Michael Wise, the Messiah before Jesus. Because when you see that title, the first Messiah, and I'm using Messiah here, not just to mean a Davidic figure, but an anointed one. He could be anointed of the Spirit. He could be priestly. He could be Davidic, but he's the guy. Right. And as you're going to see, just as Christians made Jesus the guy, prophet, priest, king, everything, the Qumran community began to look to this extraordinary person as the final word from heaven, the final revelator of everything, the final interpreter of everything. And they thought they were in the end of days. So it gives us a chance to study a figure who's apocalyptic, messianic, talking about a new covenant, talking about preparing the way in the wilderness, some very similar things to the Jesus movement. But the Jesus movement is 100 years later, you see.
Right.
So it's not a matter of, who came first. The teacher clearly came first. But I think it's just fascinating, and we're going to talk about it. You asked me, Tabor, could you do maybe the 5 big points we know about this guy?
Right.
And, even before I start that, I want to say, I don't know his name.
Right.
At least with the Nazarene, we got a name, Yeshua, right, or Yehoshua, or Jesus in English, from the Greek Jesus. But with this guy, we don't even know his name, which makes it all the more intriguing trying to place him. But we're going to see what we can get out of the texts themselves. So I'm going to give you an overview, not too many details, just the sketch. I've got some notes here with just key phrases. We don't want to get too much in the weeds. Now, in the course, we get in the weeds, not in a way that'll leave you behind, but it's just going to pull you in. And the reason we do these Zoom meetings every month is to allow you to ask questions, to have interchange, and the students actually get to know each other. This is not a webinar. Webinars are fine, but that would just be me on a screen
talking,
and hundreds of you watching me talk, and then you put your questions in the chat and I might answer 4 or 5 of them. Bye. Now, this is a group, this is a class. There's 50 people on each screen, so if we have 50 or more, you have another screen. But whenever anybody talks, they pop up, so people actually begin to refer to each other personally, well, as John said this, I was wondering that, and kind of bounce off each other. It really does. You've been in these. It has a classroom dynamic. It really does. And I want that. I want that to be that way.
So. Well, just to comment on the teacher of righteousness that I find ironic, you point out they don't mention his name, but when we say 5 things that we can know about him, are you suggesting that because there's going to be scholars who go, we can't know anything about the guy?
Yeah.
There's, we're critical scholars. We want to be critical. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but based on the writings we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that discuss the teacher of righteousness, you're saying we can actually look at them and find some pretty evident things about this character that you would say points to this is a fact about this guy, or at least is how it's observed about this person by its followers.
Certainly, the things that the group attributes to him, we could say with some certainty because we're going to read the text.
Right.
Now, did they embellish? Did they exaggerate? I think they're expressing their beliefs. So to deconstruct that into what he was is just as difficult as going back to Jesus. There has to be a method. But it's not like the Gospels where I have a narrative and then I think, well, what was embellished in that narrative? I'm creating the narrative by putting together everything that is said about him in the scrolls. And I've grouped these together, and there could be more than 5. You and I just decided on 5, I think, as a way of limiting it a little bit. But in the Zoom meeting, I'll encourage people, come up with some more. Maybe we got
based on the evidence that we're looking at.
Now, this is about him, not the content of his teaching.
Right.
We cover that as well. But the figure, like what are they saying about him? And it's really extraordinary. And in the back of your head, as I'm covering these, you're going to think, oh, Jesus, early Christianity, Jesus, early Christianity.
You can't help it. He is the black hole that gets you sucked in. Yeah,
exactly. But one thing I can say is, nobody thinks these texts are written in the time of Jesus. So we are talking about a messianic figure, let's call him, a redemptive figure, not just any, but the ultimate one. The same thing that Christians say about Jesus, Muslims say about Muhammad, and Jews say about Moses. This is their guy. Was he a cult leader? Was he a movement leader? We could call it the Dead Sea Scroll movement or the Qumran movement. They call themselves the New Covenanters. I kind of like that. But then you go like, oh, wait a minute. Didn't the early Christians also begin to think they were part of a new covenant? So it gets really interesting. Are
you sure they weren't called the People's Front of Judea? Or
yeah, right. The Palestine Liberation Front. Yeah.
Hey, that was such a funny, good part of the movie. I loved the humor.
And this is a survey. This is to whet your appetite and to encourage you to sign up for the course.
Exactly.
And then we can begin to have a relationship. And, people in the course can email me and get answers. I mean, you become my students. So it takes a lot of time, but I love working with the group that we have.
That's awesome.
Okay. You want to do the countdown?
Yeah, let's do it.
So number 1, we want to talk about when was the teacher. What can we know about when he was? And in one of the documents, it's called the Damascus document. And I'm not going to explain all the background of that. There's a whole lecture on it. We do get a kind of a funny chronology. I say funny because working out the years are not the same as our years today. So I'll read you the phrase. It's in column 1, the opening of the Damascus document. It says, in the age of wrath, 390 years after he'd given them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar. So our date would be, 586. Write that down, right? Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. He visited them and caused a plant root to spring from Israel and Aaron. This is the group and its origin. They call it a plant root, like a root out of dry ground coming up. That's not the teacher, though. Then they say, we recognize we were guilty men, and for 20 years we wandered like blind men groping for the way. Notice the word way, the way. Remember the book of Acts? They actually call the movement the way. Anybody members of the way? Here it is. 100 years earlier, people are saying, groping for the way. Now listen to this. And God observed their deeds, this little group that's trying to follow the pure way of God. And they sought him with a whole heart, and he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. Okay, so we have 390 years, and then for 20 years, they're just like, how do we follow God? What can we do? We want to seek God. We want to follow the Torah and the prophets. And this teacher comes. So if you add all that up, 390 plus the 20, you're going to come to 176 BC. That's what everybody thought for years. And that was the traditional view, that it's like just before the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabean period, 165. Now, many of us, including Michael Wise, who's done the definitive work on this, that's in the Oxford Handbook of the Dead Sea Scrolls, his article, it's just become pretty persuasive. By looking at the names of people mentioned, we now think we would date him to the 1st century BCE, not the second.
Right.
And you say, well, wait a minute, 390 plus 20, 586, how you're playing with the dates. We know from antiquity, they're not dating the Persian period like we are. So once you make the adjustments, it comes out to, some of your listeners will know Alexander Jannaeus, very famous Hashmonean ruler. He dies in 76. And around that time and shortly after, we think we can date the teacher. So I don't know if we can absolutely nail it down, but when people say, well, I put Jesus around the year 30.
Right.
I'm saying that. I'm saying I'm putting the teacher around the year 70, let's say 70 BCE.
Okay.
So that's where we generally are. And the way this is done, just so you know the method real quickly, what Wise does is he just tallies up all the historical figures that are mentioned anywhere in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they start playing out around the time of the Romans coming in and shortly thereafter. For example, no Herod the Great. Now, if they're living through the reign of Herod the Great, they're living through the reign of all the Roman emperors, and so forth, Tiberius and Augustus, the early ones, wouldn't there be something about the major events? And so you see the method is just to take the latest date mentioned. And that seems to put us in the 1st century BCE. The second point that I think we can say, they expect this guy, this teacher, whom they call the one who's going to guide them in the way of his heart, to be a prophet like Moses. Now, what does that mean? Let me just read you from the scrolls what they say. They talk about that none shall depart from the counsels of the law and walk in the stubbornness of their hearts, but shall be ruled by the precepts which the men of the community were first instructed, until there shall come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Now notice that, 3 figures, the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Maybe 2 messiahs.
Right.
That word, the prophet, you might remember from the Gospel of John. John has asked the baptizer, who are you? And you get a reflection of the kind of candidates that they're working with in that time. And they go, are you the prophet? You see how they would know this term, the prophet. And then he says, no. Are you the Messiah? He goes, no. Are you Elijah? No, that'd be the priestly Messiah. Well, who are you? And he says, I'm the voice crying in the wilderness. So Very interesting. Voice crying in the wilderness, this group in their community rule, that's where that quote comes from. This is the period before the teacher, when they're blindly groping in the way, and they set down their community rule, you see. And what it says is, just do the stuff that we figured out until the prophet comes, and then the messiahs of Aaron and Israel will come. So they got their 3 figures, just like the Gospel of John. So who's this prophet like Moses? Well, in other Dead Sea Scrolls, they quote Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 18, verse 18. And in that text, Moses is recorded as saying, after I die, God will raise up a prophet like me, and I'll put my words in his mouth, and you've got to obey that prophet. Mm-hmm. Now, that could refer historically to just any successor of Moses, any prophet. Some people say Joshua. But in the Torah, Joshua's got to go to the priest if he has a yes or no question. He doesn't sound much like the prophet like Moses. Remember, he goes to Eleazar. Eleazar says, let me check the Urim here. It's kind of some kind of dice thing that they did, yes, no. It's sort of
right.
This kind of idea. And in the New Testament, we have in Acts 3 and in Acts 7, Peter and then Stephen saying, Jesus, he's the prophet like Moses. They actually say that. So early Christians are making Jesus this main guy. And what do we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Until there come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. So they see him as the prophet like Moses. We don't need to throw up a map, but have people take a look at a map of the Judean desert where Qumran is. And if you stand Qumran and look across the Dead Sea, Derek, as you and I did when we were there, you see Nebo and Pisgah right where Moses died or disappeared, according to the last chapter of Deuteronomy. So they're waiting for another Moses to come, and they position themselves right there. I don't know for sure that's why the settlement's there. It's an Iron Age settlement that they take over. But, you know, it is a pretty well front row seat for a prophet like Moses to come. And there are lots of other texts that you could apply. So what's the big deal about the prophet like Moses? Well, he's a new Moses. He's going to be the be all and end all of a prophetic figure. You see, Jews look to Moses, Christians look to Jesus, Muslims look to Muhammad. What they're saying is another final prophet will come, and he's the prophet like Moses. And so when that is written in the community rule, he hasn't come yet. So they're just saying, hold on, God will send this guy.
Right.
Well, what you most expect often happens. Now, they also talk about in the Damascus document, and this is after he's come, they talk about the interpreter of the Torah, and then they talk about when he comes, who shall teach righteousness at the end of days. So it's getting more specific. This is the final guy that'll be like a new Moses figure. Does that sound familiar from the book of Hebrews, maybe? You see where I'm going here?
Yes.
Meaning these kinds of ideas are already circulating among apocalyptic groups in the Roman period, 100 years before Jesus. And then they say the star is the interpreter of the law. You remember that text in Numbers? A star will come and a scepter. A star is light and a scepter is rule. You know what they say? The star is the teacher who's going to come, and the scepter is the Davidic Messiah, the prince of the congregation. These are ways that they explain who this teacher is. Now, every rabbi interprets the law. I suppose all the prophets, in a way, interpret the law. But when you say the star is the interpreter of the law, he who comes who will teach righteousness at the end of days, you're saying it's the final guy.
Right.
In other words, he's not just going to, my opinion is this, like in the Talmud or the Mishnah. My opinion is this, and Rabbi Yehoshua says this, and Rabbi so and so forth says this. That's not it. Now, this is the guy that says, my decision is, and he's like Moses. Remember, they would bring things to Moses in the Torah, and he would say, okay, this and this and this. And so that's what they're expecting. They're expecting a new Moses. That's what they think is going to come. Now, what do they call him? Here, he's just called the interpreter of the Torah. We say teacher of righteousness in English, but actually, John Reeves has argued, and he's a colleague at mine at UNC Charlotte. I've retired now, but great Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He's argued that it actually means the right teacher. Another teacher of righteousness, you put the genitive in, but it's Moreh Tzedek, the true teacher. I love that. You know, that's beginning to sound very cultish. There's a lot of teachers, but are you following the true teacher, the prophet like Moses, the final guy that's coming at the end of days? You see what's happening here? Again, how many times am I going to say this? 100 years before the time of Jesus.
Right.
Okay. Number 3, this guy has the correct interpretation of the Sabbath, the festivals, clean and unclean. And again, I'm reading the Damascus document where his role is described. They will keep the Sabbath according to its exact interpretation. Remember in the New Testament, everybody's like, how do you keep the Sabbath? Jesus is criticized and dialogues with the Pharisees and the Sadducees back and forth. You know, what does it mean to rest and so forth? Big question in Judaism. Now, notice this, though, the exact interpretation and the feast and the day of fasting according to the findings of members of the new covenant. So once this teacher comes, he's got a calendar that he is approving. And we know of this calendar. We call it the Jubilees Calendar. And I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but you see that little chart. We'll put this chart into the course pack. This is new, some added material you can get. But I can explain it very clearly in terms of what they're doing. We have, just think, Derek, we have a 365 and a quarter solar year, right?
Right.
They don't like that. That's like some months are 30, some are 31, then you got to add a leap year. That's clumsy. God would not create the heavens and the earth in such disharmony. The original year is 360 days. That's in the book of Jubilees, remember? The book of Jubilees. Every month is 30. Okay, 12 times 30 is 360. And you say, yeah, but a solar year has got those 5 extra days. What are you going to do? Well, you see, if you look at this chart, you've zoomed in on it where people can see. This is like creating perfection in a disordered universe. It's unbelievable. The teacher taught this, and he might have picked it up from texts like the book of Jubilee, but they have it in great detail. It looks kind of complicated, but once you learn it, it's real simple. If you look across, you see that you got your months divided into 3 sections. Month 1, 4, 7, and 10, 2, 5, 8, 11, 3, 6, 9, and 12. There's your 12 months, 360 days. Now, in the first group, 30-day months. Second group, 30-day months. But in those last 4, and notice they're alternating them, you add 1 day. It doesn't change the day of the week. You just add 31. Now you're up to 364, you see? That means the year will get slightly off over time. They'll start thinking the seasons are out of kilter, right? It's just like, hey, spring last year was, around the time of the harvest, and now it seems like it's a little bit later. But the rabbinic calendar that's used today by Jews is a lunar calendar, and it's 11 days off. Think of it. Did you know the Muslims follow they follow the lunar calendar without intercalating those extra 11 days?
Right.
So if you've ever followed Ramadan, you go, Ramadan's in July. And a few years later, Ramadan's in January. It's moving 11 days a year.
Yeah.
So what the Jews do is they intercalate 7 out of 19 years. They put in an extra month. It's almost like jerking something back. Like, we're getting off, pull it back. We're getting off, pull it back. Now, the teacher doesn't want this. He wants harmony, perfect harmony. Now, notice this. You see that Wednesday, day 1 under month 1?
Yes.
That's because Genesis 1 says that God created the planets and the sun and moon and stars and the seasons on the 3rd day.
Got it.
So you don't need to know. All you need to know is, are you in month 1? And the Wednesday of that month will be the first day of the month. It's nothing to do with the moon. You just count. And then all the festivals, I've got them marked in red there. They come on certain days of the week. So it gave them this feeling of harmony. Now, here's a really interesting story. That would mean that Yom Kippur, you see how it's marked there in month 7? You have their festivals. I'm leaning in to look. See where that 10 is red under? Okay, that's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. There you go. It's always on a Friday. So you just start counting down 1 through 7, 8 through 14, 15 through 21. Don't you like the harmony of that? See?
Right.
And so if you were born, let's say you were born on the 17th day of the first month. You see that? Pick 17, just arbitrarily. Then your birthday is always the same day of the week and the same day of the month. Isn't that nice?
Right.
Instead of me saying, I was born March 2nd, but the year I was born, it was a Saturday, and this year they don't like that. So they believe that this is God's ordained order, and the cosmos is all coming apart, and the calendar is real important. Now listen to this. The teacher has an enemy. We don't know who he is by name, but he's called the wicked priest. And in a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, which is very important to us for the teacher, they talk about the wicked priest pursuing the teacher of righteousness to his house of exile on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Now, you see what's happening here? His Yom Kippur would be a regular day to the Jews in Jerusalem because they're keeping a different calendar. But he's got his Jubilees calendar. And he appeared before them. Now, he wouldn't be able to travel down on Yom Kippur. The wicked priest, he might even be the high priest of Israel. He'd be in the temple doing his thing on the holiest day of the Jewish year. But if the group is following this calendar that we just talked about, the teacher's Yom Kippur is a holy day that he doesn't recognize. And it says he appeared before them to confuse them and cause them to stumble on the day of fasting. Can you imagine? You're fasting on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, and the high priest from Jerusalem shows up and says, I want to talk to the teacher. And it says he wanted to abuse them and cause them to stumble. So, you know the book of Jubilees, Derek, and it actually is a book that has survived that talks about a lot of these things. Now, to us today, you go, well, who cares about the calendar and the days of the week and all that, and Sabbath? Well, this group does. They feel that they are restoring the original harmony of creation, and it feels good to them. You know, we're keeping the true feasts. So when God's presence comes on the wrong day up in Jerusalem, God's not even working with them, but we have the original true festival. So that was number 3. Number 4, this is a big one. God told Habakkuk to write down what would happen to the final generation. Wow. So you open the book of Habakkuk, it's in the Hebrew Bible. And in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2, he did not make known to him when time would come to an end, but he did say what would happen. And he says, what does that mean? This means the teacher of righteousness to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. So what they believe is this guy, once he's come, not only has he straightened out the calendar, given all the proper interpretations of the Torah, he's like a new Moses. He's bringing a new covenant, but also he has the mysteries of all the prophets. So, you know, turn to Isaiah 11, he'll tell you what it means. Turn to Isaiah 65, turn to any of the prophecies of the Bible. This guy can tell you what it means. He is directly inspired. We have other texts that say that God put his own words in this prophet's mouth. So this is a highly exalted figure. In terms of late Second Temple Judaism, he would be the most exalted figure of any kind of Jewish movement that we know of. I mean, no other leader claims this sort of revelation. Then it goes on to say that the final age will be prolonged. And I'll tell you about this in a minute. It has to do, his death was supposed to mark the final 40 years, and it didn't. That's number 5. We'll get to it. So when the end didn't come, does this sound familiar? This generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. And then it passed and all those things weren't fulfilled. Mark 13. Guess what? They quote, the righteous will live by faith. Faith in what? Faith that the teacher was really true, that his death did mark the end. Now listen to this. Whom God will deliver if you have faith in the teacher, because this was written after the 40 years has passed. It says, God has prolonged the days. The mysteries of his will are astounding. If it tarries, wait for it, it will surely come. Don't give up on the teacher. He is the true guy, okay? Notice, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering, the followers, their suffering, and because of their faith in the teacher of righteousness.
Ooh.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And these people, James, that we're doing a live stream next week, we're going to get into, maybe you should actually tease them. I don't want to give away but this is.
What is the suffering?
Right.
If any man would come after me, let him tease
up his cross and follow.
I didn't say that. We'll talk about how he died next time. Okay. So he has the revelations of all the mysteries, and his death is the final clock ticking of the countdown. Now, let me try to explain how they calculated. It's really cool to figure out. We can actually figure it out. I'll read you a couple of texts. From the day of the gathering of the teacher until the coming of the Messiah will be about 40 years. See, they actually say that. from the day of the gathering of the teacher till the end of all the men of war who deserted to the liar. The liar is the guy that fought. He's not the wicked priest. The teacher has two enemies. He's got a liar who's within the group that rises up and
kind of a Judas in a way.
Kind of a Judas and opposes him. The gathering of the teacher till the end of all the men of war who deserted to the liar will pass about 40 years. And then in one of the commentaries on Psalms, a little while the wicked will be no more. Well, how long's a little while? Remember? I will look towards his place, but he shall not be there. What does that mean? Interpreted, this means all the wicked. At the end of 40 years, they will be blotted out, and no evil man will be found on the earth. Whoa, isn't that amazing? So not only is he interpreting and bringing the new calendar, he is the kingpin of the time of the end. His death marks the final 40 years. Now, how did they come up with this? Do you remember that 390 years?
Yeah.
Add this up in your head. You can do this easily. Anybody can. 390, and then you add 20 where they're wandering and groping before he comes, right? So now we're at 410. And then we got a 40-year period that's going to lead to the end. And if you figure, well, how long did he then teach or rule or whatever, you got about 40 years left. And you come to 490 years. You get it?
Yeah.
There's add 390 plus 20 plus 40 years after his death. Then the middle period would be about 40 years. Now, I can't prove that this is exactly a date in time, but that's how they're doing it. Now, why would they do that kind of thing? Because they're trying to fit it into Daniel 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. If you studied the Bible and prophecy, and I give you the number 490, you're going to go, oh, that's Daniel 9, who predicts the coming of the Messiah, the cutting off, and the destruction of Jerusalem and so forth, and destruction of the world, of all the evil ones. Well, they call that 10 Jubilees. Why? Because a Jubilee is 49 years. 49 times 10 is 490. And it says in the scrolls that in the first week of the Jubilee that follows the 9, that would be the first week of the final 49-year period, then the atonement of all the sons of light will come. So they've actually got a date, but then the date doesn't come. So then we get a case of prophecy failing. If it tarries, wait for it, it will surely come. And that's where we kind of trail off with the teacher. So those are the kind of things we can say. We study them in detail in the course. I give lectures on each one of these points in the course. So basically, those are the 5 points, and I think we can begin to put together. Now, one other thing we have that I'm not touching on, and it'll be next time, and we're really getting into it in our Zoom meetings. We've already had 3 or 4 Zoom meetings, and that is we might have 12 Psalms, 11, maybe 12, that the teacher of righteousness himself wrote, and they're autobiographical. Now, we don't have that with Jesus.
Right.
And that, if they are from his hand, which many scholars call them the teacher hymns, and they differ as to how many. But you have a first-person guy saying things that wouldn't be true of the group. For example, if you're reading the Psalms of David, a lot of them you can just read. The Lord is my shepherd. Well, that's David, but you're a pious follower of the God of Israel. The Lord is my shepherd. I can read that. But there are other things where David might say things that have nothing to do with you. It's too specific, you see. Well, that's how these teacher hymns are. So the part I haven't given you yet, it's like the other shoe dropping. If these teacher hymns are really from the teacher, we would have first-person writing of the teacher passed down to us. You could still question how reliable it is.
Right.
But you would begin to get a feel for an actual personality. When I read these and we cover them with the students, it becomes pretty convincing. And Michael Wise's book, The First Messiah, is essentially a commentary on those hymns, in which he thinks you can really reconstruct a lot. So we got the 5 points as a framework. When did he live? What did he teach? What did he claim to do? how is his death supposed to mark the end, and what happens when it doesn't come? But then we also have his inner thoughts and ideas. And that's amazing. Like he talks about an enemy sitting at table with him and lifting up his hand against him, things like that. Or other texts, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Number of texts that are even alluded to in the New Testament as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the overview. I hope it interests people to study this first Messiah, if we could call him that. And again, I want to point out, I'm using Messiah to mean an anointed figure, a final figure that God would send who's going to sum it all up, a new Moses in this case.
There's so much interesting material to study about the Dead Sea Scrolls from whatever angle. I could see people who are spiritual or religious doing it for devotional reasons, and somehow this edifies them in their life. And then there are people like me who want to know history, who want to know, what gave rise to the whole Jesus movement to begin with. Of course, I don't think it was abracadabra. I don't think it just popped up. I think that there's a long trend of ideas among Jewish communities that are in the Hellenistic period that are coming up with these ideas post-Persia. And I really enjoy learning about this earlier guy who doesn't have a name, but that a lot of the material shows up in the New Testament that has a lot in common with this earlier movement from 100 years before. And really, I'd say longer than 100 years, because by the time the Gospels are written, we're stretching it to the latter half.
He's also called, by the way, I didn't mention this because teacher of righteousness is what we even used in the title of the show, but he's also called the beloved teacher, and get this, the unique teacher, meaning, the special one, the only teacher.
Right.
So he has these other names that might also remind you of some things that come later with the Jesus movement.
Okay. Are you the modern day teacher? No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm the
modern day teacher of the teacher. Meaning I'm teaching about the teacher.
Just in case anybody.
I'm not unique, and I don't know if I'm beloved or not.
Just to make sure everybody knows, you're just now tuning in. We covered 5 things we could probably know pretty well about the teacher of righteousness from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we know about, that was in Qumran. We placed him around the 1st century BCE, probably around 70 BCE. And you covered these 5 details. You're going to go deeper into your next Zoom meeting for those who sign up for the Dead Sea Scroll and Jesus course. And what I love about you, James, you really do follow up with your students, and you're having these hangouts. So I encourage everybody, if you haven't signed up, go sign up for the course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, the only thing I want to cover is just to say that I'm going to tantalize you without revealing as much, because I want you to come to the Zoom meeting and be in the course, because then you become part of what was called the Yachad, the community. They call themselves the Yachad. I'm not going to make you a new covenanter or anything else. I won't baptize you or take your money, because they shared their goods in common. But you'll be a part of this group that's studying this material together.
Right.
And I would just want to say that what I want to raise is, do we have enough evidence to talk carefully, not simplistically, about this extraordinary figure, the prophet like Moses, with all the revelation of all the mysteries, whose death marks the countdown to the end? Do we know enough about him to be able to say that he died by being killed, or basically, was he killed, or did he just die an old natural death in bed as he got older? Was it a violent death? Do we know anything about that? Are there any allusions to that in the scrolls? And if he died, was it expected or was it a disappointment? And whether it was expected or a disappointment, how did the community deal with the missing teacher, especially after 40 years? Once the clock quits ticking, then what's going to happen? And we do have within the Thanksgiving hymns some material that might indicate that they thought he was raised up to the heavens and given a throne among the gods. Now, if that's the case, and I'm not going to reveal it and I mainly just want to talk about suffering servant ideas. But in the Zoom meeting, we'll actually look at the text. The students already in the course have downloaded a document that your wife uploaded to the course, and it has these passages marked and so forth in the Thanksgiving hymns that we're going to discuss in the Zoom meeting.